We're going to do a Q&A session today, answering the most common questions that we've received from teachers, especially, and those who teach IELTS. So we'll try to cover speaking, writing, a little bit of reading as well. So we'll try to go over those for you and give you as much advice as we can based on this. So we'll do a brief introduction on the band descriptors, like we said before. We'll talk about that, your questions and some possible solutions, hopefully, and then some feedback and some reflection and questions if time allows. We can discuss this a little bit more. So before we get into the questions, again, like we always mention with the band descriptors, that's what we're going to try and link everything to, connect everything to, and make sure that everything's clear. And like I said, if questions come up as we're going through, just let us know in the chat and we'll answer them. We'll go over them with you. So let's get started with the questions then. I don't really think we need to do much of an introduction. So let's just get straight into the questions. So this was a question from one of our members, and they asked us how to develop vocabulary proficiency for IELTS in test preppers whose overall proficiency needs a big boost. I'd love to know how you think I would proceed if I had 6 months to a year to prepare a student like this. So let's start with the first part, Claudia. What would you suggest? Proficiency needs a big boost. How am I going to help prepare them and get them ready for that?
Yeah, so I mean, if you have 6 months to a year with the student, then your focus is general English.
Right.
You don't actually want to do IELTS in every single lesson because they'll burn out completely. So yeah, just learning topic-based vocabulary, topic-based, and make sure that those topics are connected to IELTS in some way. So for example, if you're preparing them for part 3, focus on social issues instead of just, random topics. You can connect it to IELTS. So the goal would be general English here.
Yes, exactly. Yep. So that's a great point as well. And then also think about, with their proficiency, where are they at in terms of their IELTS skills? So maybe they just started with IELTS, they're not familiar with it. So what level would they be? And try to give them texts and give them tasks and give them materials that are going to match that level. And then you can start to, as their English starts to improve, hopefully, you can also improve or raise the level of the task that you're giving them. And then as you can start to build it up as you go through. Now, I'd love to know how you think I would proceed if I had 6 months to a year to prepare a student like this. So that's a good amount of time, actually. Some students, they say they only have 3 weeks or a month, even though they don't necessarily think they're going to get the grade and they're going to have to take tests multiple times. So if we had 6 months to a year, how would we do it? Well, if it was me, I would first meet with that student, give them an assessment, figure out where they're at in terms of their level, and then build out a plan based on that level. Because if they have to jump 2 band scores, maybe they're at a 5, they need a 7, that's going to take a lot of time. And every student is different. It's impossible to say in a month or in 2 months, you can do this. Well, no, it is possible, but depends on the motivation of the student, how much work they put in, how much time they commit to it, how often they meet you, how well they do the tasks, etc. as well. So it really depends. But if you had 6 months to a year, you could definitely plan general English, general reading skills, building structures for speaking, building structures for writing, and then start to connect that and link that to IELTS as well. What would you do, Claudia, in this situation?
Yeah, so similar to you, I would create a plan based on their level. So first, where are they at so that I can meet them where they're at? And I would go through the test section by section, but with general English in mind. So, okay, let's focus on speaking for a while. And like I said, do some topic-based lessons. Then I would introduce them to the test slowly. Then we would move on to writing, depending on what they've approached you for. But yeah, my plan would be similar to yours.
Yeah, I think so. I think that's a good approach to take, and to always be connecting it and thinking about how does it connect to the band descriptors, how does it connect to their score, and going through it that way as well. Okay, perfect. Let me move on to the next slide here. So about the location. So this is an interesting question we had about location. And this is quite unusual, but we've been asked this question a few times. Is it true that for some students it's easier to get a higher score if they travel to another country or area? Simple answer for this, Claudia?
No,
No.
not
Why
true
do you
at all.
why do you think why do you think students believe this, or they think this? What is it based on, this rationale or this logic?
Yeah, that's a good question. But I think these rumors that go around, I'm not sure where they originate or what the logic is behind it. But I have heard the same thing, or I've been asked the same question. Students have told me, well, if I'm in Spain, for example, and I am from another country, maybe I'll get a higher score in Spain because my accent is different. And
Right,
this is another myth, is that your accent doesn't matter at all. We all have accents, even native speakers, even advanced speakers, we all have accents. It's about your pronunciation. So
right.
just because you have a certain kind of accent and you book the test in a different country, it doesn't mean anything, really.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And a lot of teachers ask us this as well, because they say, well, my student took it in China and they got a 6, but then they went to Korea and they got a 7. So why is that? Well, it might just be that on the day, maybe they were a little bit more fortunate with some of the questions, perhaps, and how they came up in their knowledge. But this shouldn't be the case, and it's really bad advice to suggest that a student go to another country to take a test. Shouldn't make any difference at all. And again, I've heard this a lot, and again, it comes down to cost. You know, if a student is spending thousands of dollars to travel to another country, pay for a test, book a hotel, etc., and they don't get the score they need, then it's all wasted. So this is an interesting one, but definitely not. No, that is a bit of a myth, for sure. Some students look for former examiners to learn IELTS and follow the way the examiners talk about writing, but they can't get a 7. Why? So why is this? Because I'm following the examiner's advice, I'm following the examiner's structure, I'm following what they tell me, but I'm not able to get a 7. Why is that? What am I doing wrong as a candidate?
That's a good question. Well, it would depend on the student. It
Yes.
depends on where their weak points are.
Yeah.
And if they're actually applying everything the examiner is telling them, and if they are, then this could be due to their level, because that's the
Exactly.
thing is, if you're a B1 and you want to get a 9, that doesn't work. You need to jump up a level to get
Right.
that.
And these questions, I think it's a case of the teacher or the examiner hasn't delivered the result that the student wants. So therefore, let's blame, or let's say that it's not me or it's not the teacher, it's something else external. And this comes up quite a lot. Now, in this case with the writing, well, I followed everything you told me for the writing. Well, that's fine. You might have followed the structure that we practiced. You might have followed the organization that we practiced, but I can't control, or I can't help you with the grammar, the spelling, the word choices, the punctuation. So perhaps they've made some errors there which affect their score. So there are elements that we can't control. So to answer this question, I would say, yeah, I can give you a lot of advice, strategies, ways to organize. But ultimately, if you don't match that with language, grammar, accuracy, then that's going to affect the score, because structure and organization is only 50% of it, and how well you answer the question. So the other 50% is what we need to work on. And a lot of times, grammar, spelling, word choice, punctuation, these are huge errors and huge issues for students. They don't realize that. So that when they're writing, they think, oh, my writing's great. And you look at it and think, this word doesn't make sense. So therefore, this sentence doesn't make sense. They write too much, which detracts from the task achievement. They try to say more than they need to, which means they make more errors. So it's all kind of connected. But yeah, these are common questions we've had. And again, with the first one, it just simply isn't true. If we look at the data, that isn't the case. And for the second one, again, we can only give them so much. So they need to make sure that they're working actively on grammar, accuracy, word choices, lexical resource, etc., to be successful there with that one. Okay, so scores. Again, we've had this question in the group. So I had a student who couldn't get more than 6.5, and they got a 6 in the first test, they got a 7 in the second test in a month. How can they jump like that suddenly in 1 month? What would be the reason for that?
Yeah. So again, there's so many factors to take into consideration with this. Like you mentioned, it could be that particular day, the questions that they received. It's really difficult to tell if I don't know what the situation is.
Right.
So
So
I'd be
this is, yeah, this is something really important to note as teachers if we are teaching IELTS, is that, you know, we're allowed a deviation of 0.5. So it could be that they got 6.5 in the first test overall. Sorry, 6.5 for the speaking, 6 overall. But it could be the second time around they got 7. So it was a slight deviation. So it was a half a band. So it could be up or down. So it could be that the first time the examiner was a little bit too strict or was maybe marking them slightly under, and the other one was too lenient and gave them a little bit over. So that could also happen as well, because I've had this happen where students have said, well, I got a 6 this time, I got a 7 the first time, but a 6 this second time. Why is that? Well, that could be one reason. Again, like you said, the sets of questions for speaking and writing, they are kind of predetermined. So it may just be that, oh, I actually know a little bit about the environment because I was learning about it at school, so I can talk about it more easily. Or I know a lot about social media as a teenager, so I can write about that a little bit more and use the right words. So that is one part of it. It's not luck, though. It's about having the skills to apply to those tasks. So that is one part of it. And again, it was 6.5. So again, it could be, again, just a slight deviation on that. You know, we're all human, and even examiners, you know, they're not all going to be perfectly in line all the time. There might be some deviation there, so that could answer why that might be as well. The difficulty, how is the difficulty of the test set? Some students took the test 3 times with much higher difficulty than the previous test. So they took it the first time, they said it was really easy. The second time, really, really difficult. Third time, a little bit easier than the second time. Why is that? Do I look at a list of candidates and say, oh, Claudia, I don't like her name, I'm going to give her really difficult questions? Well, no. How is this determined, Claudia? Why would this be?
Yeah, so the level of difficulty never changes. As you've mentioned,
You just froze for a second there.
it gets.
Could you just repeat that
Okay,
last point, Claudia? It just froze for a second. Yeah.
Yeah, so it could be the question as you've mentioned, but the actual difficulty of the test never changes.
Right.
It does not change.
Yes. The only possible like indicator where a student might think, oh, it was really difficult is part 3, speaking. Because in part 3, speaking, there are different sets of questions that you would pre-select for a candidate. So it's not that you're giving them deliberately difficult or easy questions, it's that you pre-select a set of questions. And some questions might be more difficult than the other, but it doesn't reflect on their performance. If they have easy questions, it doesn't mean their score's low. If they get really hard questions, it doesn't mean that their score is going to be high. It's just predetermined. So we choose and select sets of questions beforehand. So it might be that, you know, the first set of questions might be more who, what, when, where, why questions, whereas the second set might be how much, to what extent, how often, and then the third set of questions might be more kind of abstract. Some people say this, other people say this, why. It might have much more development, but essentially it shouldn't vary too much in terms of the level of difficulty. It's more about just the questions that are asked. There might be slight variation in the types of questions, but that would be why the difficulty is perceived as different, but it should be the same. Okay, this one comes up a lot, and we've had a lot of debate about this with our teachers as well, especially with the teacher group that we have. Do too many words, for example, 380 words on the writing test, does that affect the score if I write it asked me for 250. So if I write 380, would that affect my score?
No, so they don't look at the number of words you write. Like if you write 380 words, they don't say, okay, you've written 380 words, so I'm going to score you lower. However, our advice is why write 380 words? Because when you do this, you run the risk of rambling and repetition, and you run the risk of more errors. So I like to tell students for task 1, 170
Yeah.
to 190 max. Because
Yeah.
why would you want to do more than that? You're under pressure with time. You really just want to get to the point. You want to make sure your grammar is accurate. So why overdo it? And then task 2, I say 270 to about 290 max again.
Yeah.
More than that, it's just not needed.
Exactly. Yeah. It is a long day and you're essentially running a marathon. So why run the marathon and then do another bit on top? Like, doesn't make any sense. And the problem is here, when you get above that 270, 280 range in task 2, well, I'm saying too much. So the task achievement isn't there because I'm not really being, effective in answering the prompt. My paragraphs are getting too long. One paragraph is way longer than the other paragraph. So I'm losing my coherence, my cohesion. That's affecting that score. I'm trying to use different words. I don't want to repeat myself. Does this word really fit? Is it really relevant? Probably not. So that's going to affect my lexical resource. Grammar accuracy. Well, English is my second or third language. So I'm not perfect with grammar. I'm going to make mistakes. So again, it's going to bring all those scores down by doing too much. And as an examiner looking at it, if I can see 4 well-structured, balanced paragraphs, it's automatically, okay, they've understood it. They can write effectively. They can state their points very simply and, skillfully without going on too much. Because once we look at a writing response and we feel like, I'm getting lost, I'm not really clear, you're saying too much, that's when all starts to fall apart. But if you can keep it simple, clear, coherent, and to the point, that's where they're going to score actually much better. So less is actually more in the writing, especially for task 2. Stick to stick to it. If you're being asked to write 250 words, don't say, oh, well, I know you asked for 250, but here's 400. Why? It doesn't make any sense. And this is a very, very common pitfall. Students think, I need to write lots. I need to show off everything. I need to use all this really fancy vocabulary. But if you don't have the skills and the prerequisite ability to do that, then why would you try to push yourself? Again, it's possible to score a band 7 with just very simple, easy, clear language. You don't have to reinvent the wheel. And this is really important to stress to your students that you work with as well. All right. Examiner behavior. So many students have complained that the examiners get impatient and they interrupt the students when they're talking. This made us question how the examiners were selected. Have you really followed strict standards every time? So this came from our group of teachers. They asked us about this. They said, students complain, they get interrupted, they lose their focus, they get, very anxious, they think they made a mistake. Do you really do this? Like, is this what you're told to do? And again, kind of another myth here, Claudia. So what is this all about?
Yeah, so simply put, the examiner is just doing their job. They have a time limit and they have a set of questions that they need to stick to. The only time they're flexible with their script is in part 3, but they're never flexible with the time. They have to stick to that time, and they will get into trouble if they don't stick to that time. Exactly. So we always say to students, please don't try and finish your answer. When the examiner says, okay, thank you, then just leave it. Nowhere in the band descriptors does it say you need to finish or complete your answer. And if anything, you might just annoy the examiner because now you're putting them under stress and pressure for the rest of the exam.
Exactly. The examiner has a clock or a stopwatch, and every section has to be timed almost to the second. There's a little bit of flexibility with the sections, like a couple of seconds, but as an examiner, if they're over that time requirement by 1 or 2 seconds, that's a big problem. So they have to be right on time with the cues. So if they say, okay, thank you, or just say thank you, that is code for stop, finish. And students find that very difficult. They want to keep going, they want to keep saying more, and that causes problems. So yeah, just note that if you hear thank you, okay, thank you, stop, finish. Have we followed the strict standards? Yes, I have. I've had students cry in tears, argue with me, I didn't finish, I need to finish. And I can't say anything other than Thank you. I can't say anything. I can't explain to them. I can't stop the test in the middle and have a chat with them. Had students, complain about me for not letting them finish and interrupting them. But again, help them understand that, okay, the examiner has a very strict time limit and they have to hit all those time requirements, because if they don't, it's actually a problem for them. And it's not any reflection on the student's performance. It's just a time management thing. That's all it is. So again, that's a really important part. Do interviewers or do the examiners select part 2 to 3 topics randomly? Claudia, are these done randomly?
Well, going into it, they would have chosen. So
Yes.
they don't just choose randomly when or during the test. So they would have
Yes.
decided on that before.
Yeah, generally what I did when I was an examiner before was I'd look at my list for the day and I have a booklet to choose the questions out of and all the different sets of questions. So I would just say, Catherine, 1, 2, 3, Claudia, 4, 5, 6, Mary, 7, 8, 9, Liz, 10, 11, 12. And I would just go through it that way with the sets of questions. So they're not randomly selected, they are pre-selected on the day. So there's a lot of variation there. And I wouldn't necessarily think this student is an English speaker as a first language, so I'll give them really hard questions. No, it's just done entirely randomly, blindly, without thinking about it, just to ensure fairness for everyone. And then also one thing to note is that the part 2 and part 3 topics, I'm sure you know, but the part 2 and 3 topics will be related or standard in terms of the subject, in terms of the topic. It will be related, maybe not exactly, but there would be some connection between them for sure. For example, you might be talking about social media in part 2. So in part 3, we might be talking about attitudes towards social media or attitudes towards the media. Part 2, you might be talking about advertising. So in part 3, you might be talking about shopping culture or behavior, consumer behavior, those kinds of things as well. Yeah, so that's what it means in regards to them being randomly selected. Yeah, it's really interesting, the questions that we learned a lot from these, so thank you for sending them. Okay, next one. Do examiners usually take notes during the test, if any? For what kind of purposes? So why do they take notes? Do they take notes, Claudia?
Yeah, so they, as we said before, they assess you based on the band descriptors. So they'll need to take notes about your performance, and they'll
Yes.
measure that by the band descriptors. So that's what they're
I
doing.
would generally just write down the timings because I want to make sure I know how much time I have. So I would write down the timings and I might put little codes to myself, little code words and little code symbols to represent certain things. And I would see sometimes people trying to peer over to see what I'm writing, but they couldn't see it anyway and they couldn't figure it out. But again, I wouldn't pay too much attention to that. If someone's taking a lot of notes, it's not a reflection on the student's performance. If someone's taking no notes, again, not a problem. That's just for their own personal use, however they need that, the examiner. And then a lot of you said, you said you've worked with Chinese students or students from China. So what are the most common mistakes and errors? So this is actually a really good question because it helps us focus on what we need to do. And I know, Mary, I know you had this question as well, which we answered at the beginning. I'll go back to it. But yeah, what are the most common mistakes and errors that you found, Claudia?
For me, it's memorizing answers. I've noticed that whenever I work with Chinese students, in the first lesson, they'll give me a memorized answer, and then I try and ask them something else. Yeah, that's, I think it's just this idea of if I memorize, I will score higher, because in school, we have to learn information, we have to memorize that information and answer questions based on that information. But in IELTS, it's different. It's a practical test. It's about learning skills and tools. And yeah, so that's what I notice is the memorization.
Absolutely. And this happens to me as well. And I would say, like, do you like English pop music? Do you like English movies and TV shows? Yeah, sure. I'm like, could you recite word for word your favorite movie in English? No. Okay. So if you're trying to recite word for word memorized responses to questions, there's 30, 40, 50 different topics that could come up. How well are you going to be able to do that? Oh, okay. Okay. Maybe I should start actually learning now. So that's one thing that does come up. And again, phrases, certain idioms, certain chunks, like, that's fine. because again, those can be really useful. I mean, when I was learning other languages, I started off with chunks. Okay, how does this fit in? Is this correct? So that's okay. But it's not a full memorized response, because chances are, if you're trying to memorize responses as a student, you're probably trying to cover for a lack of proficiency or a lack of skill in certain areas. That's why you're memorizing. It just doesn't really work. And if an examiner hears a student memorizing, well, if they can memorize, great, but unlikely. And if they're not really answering or really directly trying to engage with the task, we'll just kind of ask a different question or guide them in another way in part 3 especially. So that does come up a lot for me as well. Grammar, for Chinese students, pronouns is a huge one. He, she, they always get them confused, so I just say a way to fix that, and especially to be inclusive, just use their, they, them as pronouns instead of he, she. That way hopefully you won't offend anyone, and also you're also not really having to worry about getting it wrong. He, she, he. You can just say they, them, they, them. Then that way you're trying to fix that one. It's an easier fix, not perfect, but it can help. And then also grammar, so things like, especially in writing, use of commas, use of capital letters, those are huge ones. Subject-verb agreement can sometimes be quite faulty as well. And then also I've noticed with Chinese students as well sometimes is they would like to try to use, how can I explain this? They'll try to use words that they think are correct. They'll just try to like throw stuff in there, and you've got to really be listening for the word. And you have to kind of play a guessing game of, you said this word in English, but I have no idea what it means. And they're like, oh, because we think in Chinese that it's an English word, and it isn't. So they have some like loan words that they've developed, and that can be really confusing as well. Yeah, it was like, I can't remember what it was. There's a word that came up, hotation. Hotation. I love to go hotation. I was like, hotation, how do you spell that? And we're just like, okay, it's a vacation where you go to a hotel. Okay, hotation. I'm like, that is not a word that I'm familiar with in English, so you've taught me something. And this was hotation. I'm like, okay, so there we go. And they were talking about when they went to Canada on holiday, and they said, oh, we went to this district, it was a really hot place. And I'm like, Canada in the winter was a hot place? And they meant it's like a very cool place for people to hang out, and to young people go there. I'm like, okay, so these, you also got to catch these, because if they're using them in an exam, it's probably going to get lost in translation somewhere. So just give them alternative simple language they can use. Yeah, so your students will really be the best teachers for you, and they'll also help you with that as well. But those are a couple of things that I found as well. Okay, during part 2, how would you tell when a candidate is repeating rehearsed lines? And does it even matter if they're repeating rehearsed lines, Claudia?
Yeah, it matters. An examiner can tell, a teacher can tell immediately, because it sounds robotic, and that's the point, is that their fluency will be affected. So yeah, and as soon as an examiner knows or notices this, they will ask a different question, or they may score lower for this. It does matter, because
I've seen in the 1 minute planning time them furiously trying to write down their answer word for word in English or in whatever language they speak as a first language. And it just, again, they don't have the time, they don't have the skill to be able to do that. Again, definitely, like what we say for part 2 is make some boxes, make some squares with the questions, because in the part 2 task, it's usually W questions: who, what, when, where, why, how. Have a few keywords for what, who, when, where. And then when you give your answer, you can organize it using the method who. So first, let me tell you who it was. Okay, I've got some keywords. Okay. When. Let me tell you when I went there. Okay. Nice and clear, nice and organized, moving from section to section. How did you feel? Let me tell you how I felt about this. Okay. And would you go there again in the future? So would I go there again? Use the language that you're given, paraphrase it, and just develop it and build it. It doesn't have to be super complex, This is a nice way, an easy way to start building and organizing, because what I always say to students when they're building the IELTS skills is, you need the foundations first of a good level of English, and then you can build the strategies, build the outline, and put everything together step by step. So yeah, don't rehearse lines, don't memorize lines. Chunks of language, sure. Synonyms, sure, try to remember those. Certain idiomatic language, sure. Linking, connectors, yeah, you can definitely try to remember those, but we're not memorizing whole chunks because it's just not going to work, unfortunately. Okay, great question again. Would the outfit during the interview affect the final grade? And well, they're probably looking at this laughing, thinking, what? But question I've been asked more than once. I need to wear a suit, like I need to wear a full, like, shirt and tie. I need to be professional because when the examiner sees that, they're going to know I'm serious and that I'm ready. No, we're not. There's nothing on the band descriptors, like we said, that nothing that refers to how they dress. Are some candidates quite casual, like t-shirt and flip-flops and shorts? Yeah, sure, I've seen that. Have I seen other people like, all like fully formally dressed in the middle of summer in a full suit? Yes. Didn't affect their score at all. It's a real myth, a real red herring, this one. But we do get this question. And I mean, I think the logic here is any advantage I can get, any little boost I can get, then great. And first impressions when you're in an interview are very important. So if I treat it like an interview, then I'll get a better score. Well, no, that should not be the case whatsoever. Would the age of candidates be considered when giving part 3 answers, Claudia?
Yeah, so I understand why we got asked this question, because they're trying to say, like, could you ask a teenager about work, for example, and a work environment? In that situation, the examiner may, not change the topic, but just
tweak it
a little bit to suit the teenager, or because we have some students who are really young who take the test.
Exactly, that's true.
That's the only reason, not the age itself.
Yeah, I've had probably candidates maybe as young as 9 or 10 years old. So if I'm asking them about their future career plans, they're probably not going to have much of an idea. So I might have tweaked it and say, when you're older, what type of job would you like to do? Okay, that's fine. I think it was one about driving and like driving habits. Well, they can't even ride a bicycle, let alone drive a car. So again, I might say, in the future, or when you're older, or once you graduate. Okay, so we can tweak those slightly. But we wouldn't make any special considerations. Again, the questions are pre-selected, so they're not necessarily going to give any extra allowance for the age. Likewise, if we had candidates who are slightly older, we're not going to change it for them. So why should we change it for the younger candidates? Again, so we just maybe tweak the tense or slightly change the subject, but that would only be very minor tweaks in the follow-up questions for part 3, especially. Okay. Great question so far. So next one. Which part is the most crucial among the 3 parts in IELTS? So which one is the most important, Claudia? Is there a specific one that's the most important that we have to do really well in?
Well, yeah, once again, I understand why they're asking this question, and I would say that part 2 and part 3 hold more weight. But that doesn't mean that part 1 is not important.
Yes.
And I think it's important to know that, so that when you're preparing your student, you don't spend too much time on part 1. I mean, essentially, it's an interview. Their answers need to be short and simple. And so part 2 and part 3, that holds more weight.
I agree. They're all equally important. Yes. Part 1 is the warm-up. So again, I'm still very actively listening and I'm still actively taking notes, but really part 2 is where it starts to ramp up a little bit, and part 3 is where we really establish where the student is at. I might have a picture within 30 seconds. Okay, this is going to be a long struggle. Maybe their score is not going to be that high, but I've had it where they start off really slowly and do really well towards the end. I've had it the opposite, where they start off really well in part 1 and just slowly fade and tail off towards part 3. So they're all equally important, to be honest. You can't really perform well if you have a really bad part 1, part 2. Like, they all need to be fairly consistent. Again, there might be some situations where in part 2, they run out of things to say. Maybe the time's a little bit short, so it might affect them slightly, but they're all equally important, sorry to say. Yeah. Which one affects delivery the most? Grammar, lexical resources, fluency, or pronunciation? Which one affects delivery the most, Claudia?
Yeah, so I mean, all of these things are important, but fluency, if you're talking about how you express your opinion and how you deliver that opinion, then fluency is really important in this situation. But all of them are important.
Yeah. And I would agree with that, because even if I'm having a conversation with you and I don't understand everything 100%, as long as you're speaking fluently, well, then at least I can catch what you're saying, right? If I can catch 80% of what you're saying, as opposed to you saying nothing, then there's a big difference there. Again, lexical resource is important as well, like the words that you use, the way that you speak. Pronunciation, again, refers to things like pauses, intonation either rising or falling, questions, stress on certain syllables. Like these really differentiate between a band 5 or a band 8 or 9 even. So when you're working with students, these are definitely things you can think about. You can break them down into these elements, but fluency is the most important one. Having ideas, having things to say, being able to speak confidently. That's the first barrier you really have to break down, because if a student's not willing to speak, then it doesn't really matter how good the rest of it is. If they're not saying anything, how can you give them feedback? How can you give them guidance? How can you give them advice? So build the confidence, get them speaking as much as they can on things they know to start with, and then you can start working into the topics and connecting to the topics, and then you can start working on the other things: grammar, lexical resource, pronunciation. So yeah. Speaking at length is what we must follow. So to get a band 7 or higher, we generally need to speak at length, be able to develop, extend, and support answers. Those are the 3 words that are in there: develop, support, and extend. So develop, so here's my point, I'm going to explain it, I'm going to give an example to support it, I'm going to be able to hopefully, connect to the task or the question. But how long would a part 1 answer have to take to be appropriate? So part 1 is a short interview, 4 to 5 minutes. If an answer is over 40 seconds, would that be a problem, Claudia?
It won't be a problem. Your score won't be affected, but it will be distracting, because you will be interrupted all the time. And it just puts pressure on both you and the examiner. So I think it's important to actually train your students according to certain times. So for example, part 1, 2 sentences, 20 to 25 seconds, if you can get them to get a feel for that. It just doing that allows everything to go smoothly. It just feels better. And then I would say part 3, like 30 to 40 seconds, because that's more of a discussion. So 3 to 4 sentences.
Yeah, that's exactly what we teach. We say 2 to 3 sentences in part 1 and 3 to 4 sentences in part 3. So yeah, you can follow PEE for part 1 and PEL for part 3, just to break it down. And again, in part 1, the examiner is going to get through 3 sets of questions, 3 topics. And if they don't get through them, that's a big problem. So they need to be able to go through them. So keep it nice and short, 2-3 sentences, it's fine. And then in part 3, you can really develop and extend further if you need to. So that's important as well. So yes, good points here, and good question about the length. Again, give them the strategy, give them the technique. They follow that, they should be perfectly fine and not distract from that. So yes, okay. For the reading test, and let's talk about reading, because this is something that doesn't get much attention, and this is really important. So skimming and scanning, are these the most important skills in the reading test, Claudia?
Skimming is important because you have to skim to locate the answer, but once you locate that answer, you need to confirm that it's the answer by understanding the context. So you can skim, but if you don't understand context, if you don't, if your reading comprehension is not at a good level, then skimming doesn't mean anything in that situation.
Yeah, and not only that, the most important part in reading is understanding the question, because I can go and skim and scan, but if I don't know what the question means or what it's asking me to find, then I'm kind of wasting my time. And the biggest challenge students say that they face in the reading test is we don't have enough time. Well, you don't have time to read all the texts. So have your, the way I say this is look at it like a shopping list when you go to the supermarket or the grocery store, right? Write out the questions on my list. This is what I need to find. and then I can work backwards, and I can save time and be efficient, and I can be effective and productive. Because if I go to the supermarket and I don't have a list, it takes me a really long time. I don't know what I want. I don't know where it is. I don't know how to find it. But if I have my list, I can just say, here's my question I'm looking for. What year was this founded? I can go back. I can skim for a year. Okay, here's the year. Was founded in 1807. Okay, then I can write in my answer. So it's a really fast way to do it. Are these the most important skills? I would say they are, provided you understand the question and you understand what you need to do. So yes, I would agree with that. It is important, but you need to have the understanding of the questions first. Now, in the answer sheet, can I write T instead of true for the true, on F for false, and NG for the true, false, not given? Can I do that?
Yeah, it should be fine, as long as it's clear.
Yeah, as long as it's clear. So yeah, as long as an examiner or the OCR reader can read that it's T for true, F for false, and G for not given, that's fine. I have seen that many times and that's not a problem. What if I put, instead of yes, what if I put true? And for no, what if I put false? Is that okay?
Nope, that'll be marked as
Yes.
incorrect.
Yes, students have asked that.
Yeah, because you're not
yes is true and no is false, right?
instruction.
No, it's not. Yeah. So sometimes they say, well, true
Yeah.
is yes. No, I'm like, no, it's not. Anyway, not always. Okay, next one. When the instructions state that the candidate should answer in, for example, no more than 3 words, I put that in block capitals. Would they lose marks by writing an answer with more than 3 words, even if one is a or the?
Yes.
Yes,
100%.
even though these are articles,
Yeah.
they are still words. So yes.
Mhm.
Yes. So if it says no more than 3 words, that means no more than 3 words. If it says
Yeah.
write T, F, and G, write T, F, and G. So yeah, exactly. Be really careful with the check the questions, read the questions. Yes, yes, yes. Yeah, it's very frustrating if a student puts all this time and effort in, doesn't read the question, and scores poorly because they haven't understood how to answer them. So this is really, really important as well, for sure. Yes. All right, let's go to the next part. So trying to go a bit deeper here. People always ask, what are the sources of the IELTS reading passages? So where are these actually taken from? Where are these actually derived from? From what I know, again, we don't have inside expert advice on this because, again, we're not privy to that. But generally speaking, the IELTS reading passages come from news articles that developed from other kind of reading materials that you might come across in daily life. I've seen a lot of topics, they generalize certain topics as well in terms of the reading passages. So generally giving them things from, news websites, those kinds of things, tech websites, those kind of things are okay. You don't need to provide them with, scientific papers or research journals because that's just way above what they need. What are some other sources of IELTS passages, Claudia?
Yeah, so like you said, articles, journals, things like that will help them. In our resource slide, we have given some places there, but even things like The Guardian, BBC News,
Yes.
there's a website, Big Think, I think that's what it's called. There are so many different topics, and what's great is that can help for part 3 as well, part 3 speaking, because it's very much about what's happening right now in all aspects of society. So yeah.
And also the vocabulary that they need as well. They can look at good structures of writing. And when you're talking about it as well, listening to those words and hearing them being spoken correctly is really important as well. The difficulty of the articles, will they be progressive? Generally, I would say no. I think they're not necessarily done easy, medium, hard in terms of the reading test. Generally can be, some might be easy. It's how you perceive it, I guess, as a student. So they wouldn't be progressive. They're generally just reading text standalone. They're not really put in an order as such. So no, they wouldn't be progressive. And does it matter when answering yes, no, the true, false? Yeah, we just said this. Of course it does, because something being true is not necessarily yes, and something being false is not necessarily no. But again, this has come up and someone said, I scored poorly because I put yes instead of true. Well, why even open yourself up for that kind of, this kind of problem? Just follow the instructions clearly, basically, and then you'll be successful. So yes, I think that is all the questions that we had. So if you have any questions, let us know.